Now, here's the here's the non-supernatural interpretation that I find the most plausible. I find it to be the best rival to the angel hybrid, the angel-human hybrid view, and that is that the Nephilim are offspring of ancient divinized kings and just regular women. I'm going to interact exclusively with Michael Jones's video on this, since I think he gives the strongest defense of this view. And we're going to be looking at some clips from Genesis 6, from Inspiring Philosophy, from his video Genesis 6 and the Nephilim. And I know we're going to go a little over time, but I'm still going to stick around for some Q&A, provided that you have questions, and I hope you do. I haven't looked at the chat, but I'm guessing, well, I see one comment. I'll address that later. Anyway, Michael Jones starts off his video by saying, quote, "The sons of God refer to earthly kings or tribal leaders who used their power and authority to begin practicing polygamy, or the right of first night, by taking as many as they chose," end quote.
For the arguments for this view, and then address the main arguments for the angelic interpretation. My argument will be based on 4 points: immediate context, surrounding context, the larger context of the entirety of Genesis, and cultural parallels. First, if nothing from the Hebrew Bible survived to the present, except these 4 verses, it could hardly be argued this passage refers to any sort of union between women and divine beings. Go with me for a minute and just look at what the text says by itself, without thinking of what later authors might indicate. The text begins by telling us mankind began to multiply throughout the land. Then it introduces another group, called sons of God, who wed daughters of men. Then in verse 3, God says, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh." Oddly enough, God's own statement tells us who has caused his anger. It was men, not men and divine beings. Verse 3 indicates the 2 groups of verse 2 were 2 classes of humans. Verse 1 sets the context. It is about humankind producing offspring. And verse 3 indicates the problem arises from 2 classes of humans.
So that's
So I'll offer the arguments for this view, and then address the main arguments for the
So here is how I responded to that argument in my paper, Genesis 6, the Nephilim, descendants of Cain, Neanderthals, ancient kings, or angel-human hybrids. I said, quote, "The problem with this argument is that it clearly is an argument from silence, and it does not take into account the rest of the evidence. Obviously, if human beings were willingly having sex with divine beings, they would be guilty of the sin of abandoning the natural created order and, as Jude says, engaging in sexual immorality and seeking after strange flesh. In this case, the human women would be seeking the strange flesh of the angel. Moreover, it is clear that while the Nephilim incident was one reason that God sent the flood, it was not the only reason. General human depravity was also a motivating factor, as Christians have traditionally believed. This is evident from verses 5 and 6, which say, 'The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I created, from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them.'" ESV. So of course God would say that his spirit would not strive with man forever. Human beings were just as guilty as the divine beings who left their proper abode, as Jude 6-7 says. That God does not mention divine beings in his statement of who he will not strive with forever is no indication that there is no one else that he is striving with, end quote. Then I go on to say, quote, this is the same illogic that young earth creationists employ in trying to argue that no one ever ate meat prior to the flood, based on Genesis 1:29, which says, and God said to them, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed and its fruit. You shall have them for food, and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so, ESV. Young earth creationists argue from this passage that God does not mention to the humans and the animals that he has given them any sort of animals for food. He only mentions plant yielding seed and every tree with seed in its fruit. Young earth creationists argue that, therefore, everyone, human and animal alike, had a vegetarian diet. But just like Jones' argument from Genesis 6:3, the fact that God does not mention that he gave other animals to eat in Genesis 1 does not mean at all that he did not give other animals for food. You cannot make an argument on the basis of what you do not find in the text. To do so commits the logical fallacy known as the argument from silence. Whether or not there was carnivorous activity before the fall, one would have to look at other evidence, whether that be evidence in the Bible or scientific evidence. Likewise, whether or not those coming under God's judgment, the Great Deluge, consist of more than human beings, one would have to look at more than just this passage, end quote. Then I say, moreover, the term sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim, in Hebrew almost always refers to divine beings in the Old Testament. The usages of B'nai Ha-Elohim, which refer to divine beings, are to be found in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 to 9, Job chapter 1, verse 6, Job chapter 38, verse 7, and Psalm chapter 82, verse 6. This makes the likelihood that it also refers to divine beings in Genesis 6 very likely. The only times in the Old Testament in which the term does not refer to a divine being is when it is referring to corporate Israel, as in Exodus 4:22. In the New Testament, in the New Covenant, the phrase carries over to refer to human Christian men who become sons of God through adoption by the Holy Spirit, as we see in John chapter 1, verse 12. However, in the Old Testament, 7 out of 10 times it refers to divine or angelic beings. Michael Jones acknowledges this fact in his video, but basically says, I'm sorry, my nose is just itching. But basically says, so what? It's used to refer to human beings at times as well. And he cites 2 Samuel 7:14, Exodus 4:22, Deuteronomy 14:1, and Psalm chapter 80, verse 15. True enough, but I'm not going to hang the quasi-divine or angelic hybrid interpretation on a single title. I do use it as evidence, but only as one piece of evidence in a cumulative case.
Outside of the Hebrew scriptures, it was common to refer to the king as a son of God. In the Ugaritic myth, King Keret is identified as son of El. In the ancient Gudea cylinder, the ruler of Gudea is also referred to as a son of a god. So is possibly another Sumerian ruler. So calling ancient kings sons of God was an ancient cultural norm, and given the immediate context of the passage, there is nothing incoherent about the sons of God being ancient rulers who became corrupt by becoming polygamous, which the line, they took as their wives any they chose, would indicate.
Oh, come on now. And to this point that I just played, I respond by saying, quote, but again, the case for the angelic hybrid interpretation does not rest solely on the phrase sons of God. But moreover, it is indeed the case that pagan ancient kings considered themselves to be offspring of deity. But nowhere else in the Bible is the term sons of God used in reference to such rulers, unless you presuppose that Genesis 6 is an instance of that. I think it would be quite odd that Moses, or whoever wrote Genesis, would sort of legitimize their divinized kingship by calling them sons of God. You would think that Moses would want to delegitimize their divine authority, especially considering that Moses just got done battling with a king, Pharaoh, who considered himself to be a god, and a god who could go toe-to-toe with Yahweh, no less. This would be quite unusual, given that in Genesis 1, many scholars find anti-pagan god polemics. For example, instead of calling the sun and moon by their Hebrew names, which were also the names of deities who were worshipped by those names, he simply calls them the greater light and the lesser light. And he doesn't even bother to mention them until day 4 of the Genesis creation narrative. Why would Moses not also use non-divine terms to delegitimize the divine nature of these ancient pagan kings? Perhaps Jones could argue that he used the phrase to alert his readers that kings who believed themselves to be divine were the identity of who he was talking about. However, Moses could have identified them without directly calling them sons of God. He could have said, kings who believed themselves to be sons of God, or rulers who thought themselves to be gods, or something like that. I realize that Hebrew is a small language, but it wasn't so small that Moses couldn't have used a different vocabulary.
Shows would indicate, as John Walton says, in this interpretation, the sons of God are the heroic tyrant kings of old. The daughters of men refer to any female in the kingdom. Next, what about the Nephilim? Well, the internal context also doesn't suggest we are talking about quasi-divine beings. First, John Walton and Kenneth Matthews note the phrase, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, could refer to the very next line of the sons of God mating with the daughters of men. Thus, the passage could mean the Nephilim were not the direct descendants of the sons of God, but simply a group that existed before the transgression of the sons of God. Therefore, the reference to Nephilim would just denote this was a heroic age. Now, it shows would indicate.
To this point in my paper, I respond, while I have nothing but the utmost respect for Professor John Walton, I think that he is utterly wrong here, as is Michael Jones. This interpretation of the Nephilim makes the Nephilim utterly unconnected to the flood narrative in any way. Basically, it amounts to Moses saying, the sons of God went into the daughters of men. By the way, there were these mighty warriors around. Now, because of the sin of the sons of God and the daughters of men, God is going to destroy the world. Clearly, the presence of the Nephilim is not a random historical fact that Moses decided to throw in there because he found it to be an interesting factoid. There's clearly a connection between the sin of the sons of God and daughters of men and the presence of the Nephilim. These two are connected, as the vast majority of Old Testament and ancient Near Eastern scholars agree. Jones then goes on to say that even if angelic hybrid proponents are correct in saying that the Nephilim are the direct offspring of the sons of God and daughters of men, the problem is that the immediate context of the text defines what the Nephilim are for us. Jones underlines this part of the passage in his YouTube video that says, these were the mighty men who were of old, the men of the name. The Hebrew word here is gibborim. So Jones is basically like, look, it says these are just men, mighty men, men of the name. They're men, not half God, half human creatures. This is a very poor argument. Obviously, if the quasi-angel was an adult male of great strength and stature, we would expect them to be called mighty men. What other term would the author use to describe them? After all, on my view, they would be at least half human, so calling them men with any kind of prefix or suffix seems appropriate in my opinion. Moreover, by this reasoning, the reasoning that because the term mighty men is used, that therefore these are just regular human beings, Michael Jones would be forced to say that the men who appeared to Abraham in Genesis 18 were also just ordinary men, pure humans. This is because Genesis 18:2 says, quote, "And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and cast himself toward the ground," end quote. King James Version. The Hebrew word here, translated as men, is anasim. Although it is not the same Hebrew word used in Genesis 6, gibborim, nevertheless, I think that a similar argument could be employed. Anasim is also is most often used of ordinary men, like we read in Genesis 12:10 and Genesis 13:8. So if Jones is going to argue that gibborim, mighty men, means that the Nephilim were just regular human beings, then he would also have to say that the men who went to visit Lot and saw them were not really angels, and that is obviously not a valid interpretation. By the way, it just occurred to me, there is a place in the Old Testament where Yahweh is called a Gibborim. I think it's the song of, it's either the song of Deborah or the song of Miriam. I can't remember which. I'm just going based off of memory here, and I don't have it in this slide. But Yahweh, I mean, he's clearly a divine being. He's the divine being. You can do some your own research, Google that. But that just came to me. It's in one of the, I think it's the Song of Miriam, like right after the Exodus, but I'm not sure.
Genesis 4, Cain's focus is on himself, not his family. It is all about his name and his own reputation. He builds a settlement which is about honoring the name of his son. His descendant, Lamech, is boastful and gloats his own accomplishments to bolster his own reputation. Then, of course, we hear about his polygamous actions as well. After the break in the story to present the genealogy from Adam to Noah, it would make sense for the story to pick up where it left off with the sins of humanity reaching a peaking point in pride, violence, and polygamy. This is probably why Genesis 6 refers to the sons of God taking wives, plural, as they chose. My argument is it picks up where we left off with Lamech taking multiple wives. Now, not only have the descendants of Cain fallen into polygamy, the rulers of humanity, the ones meant to mediate between God and the rest of mankind, have fallen into this sin that God detests. They have become greedy and lustful, and their descendants are also focusing on making a name for themselves, not on honoring the name of God. Genesis 3 is about the fall of the first priests, Genesis 4 is about the fall of the family, and Genesis 6 is about the fall of civilization. The sequence just simply flows. As Meredith Klein says, in Cain's dedication of his city to the name of his heir, there was foreshadowed the lust for a name that was increasingly to mark these city rulers, until when the city-states began to be theocratically conceived, they esteemed themselves veritable sons of the gods, and so men of name. Structurally, the accounts of Lamech and the sons of God are much alike. In each case, there are the taking of wives, the bearing of children, and the dynastic exploits. Genesis 6:1 and following simply summarizes and concludes the course of dynastic development, which had already been presented in the individual histories of the several rulers, indicating how the evil potential of Canaanite kingship, betrayed even in its earliest beginnings, was given such full vent in its final stages, as to produce a state of tyranny and corruption intolerable to the God of heaven. Next, the surrounding context after Genesis 6 also indicates we are talking about polygamous kings. Right after this section, the author says all flesh had become corrupt, and God once again pronounces his judgment will fall on mankind, not humans and divine beings like in Genesis 3. But also notice how Noah is described. Noah is contrasted with the unrighteous humans of his day as being a righteous man, and we are reminded constantly of one of the features of Noah, that he had one wife, and his sons each only had one wife. In fact, between Genesis 6 and 8, we are told 5 times Noah only had one wife. This seems like overkill for a high-context society. The author seems to want to remind us a distinguishing feature of Noah is that he was
monogamous. By the way, if you have questions, leave them in the live chat. I promise we are close. We are close to being done, and I will answer them after we get done. Well, in response to this portion of Michael Jones's video, I say in my paper on Genesis 6, I'll be honest, I don't know what to make of the repeated statement that Noah has only one wife. However, I'll explain near the end of this subsection why this inability to explain this feature doesn't make me doubt the angelic hybrid interpretation. However, while polygamy is a sin in the Bible, there are various instances of it, even regarding biblical heroes, as Jones himself points out. Yet God did not seem to consider it so awful a sin that death was the punishment, especially death of all humankind. In fact, almost everyone agrees that polygamy was the norm in the ancient Near East, well after the time of the flood. And yet God lets these marriages go on. It doesn't seem plausible to think that the reason God sent the flood upon the ancient world was that people were polygamous. Something far more serious was going on.
Genesis is the author's hatred of polygamy for the disastrous consequences it causes. It would fit that the authors would indicate this is one of the sins which brought about the punishment of the flood. It simply aligns with a reoccurring issue they bring up. Second, Meredith Klein notes Nimrod also falls into the same category as the Nephilim, as a mighty man. The same word used to describe Nimrod is also used to describe the Nephilim. Yet it is clear Nimrod was not semi-divine, but a descendant of Cush.
Well, again, there's that place in the Old Testament where God is called a Gibberim, a man of war. I think the English translations say man of war. Oh, I hate how Google Slides does the videos. Anyway, I respond to this in my paper. Jones is presupposing that Nimrod is not a semi-divine person. In Brian Godawa's novel, Gilgamesh Immortal, he speculates that the Gilgamesh from the Epic of Gilgamesh was actually the biblical Nimrod, and that the biblical authors called Gilgamesh by the name of Nimrod because it was a jab against him. This is not at all an implausible hypothesis because, as Godawa points out in his appendix to Gilgamesh Immortal, the Hebrew writers of the Bible frequently engaged in the renaming of enemies for political purposes. Beelzebul, the god of Ekron, is renamed Beelzebub by the author of 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 2 to 6, which means the derogatory Lord of the Flies. The wicked queen of Tyre, whose name Isabel meant "Where is the prince of Baal?" was renamed by the Jews as Jezebel, which is a slurring wordplay on dung. 2 Kings 9:37. In fact, Genesis 11:9 even explains its polemical renaming of the city of Babylon, gateway of the gods, to Babel, confusing of tongues. In Noah Primeval, Godawa tells the story that the Watchers implanted in Cush's mother genetic codes that would unfold in giants as the generations went on. But regardless of whether Godawa's speculation on Gilgamesh and Nimrod have any basis in actual history, the Bible is clear that giants appeared after the flood. In fact, the land of Canaan was crawling with them. The Watchers may have gone into the human women after the flood, just like they did before the flood. Regardless of how it happened, I am inclined to believe Nimrod was a god-human hybrid precisely because the Gibberim label is applied to him. Now, I actually am not quite as firm on this part of my paper as I was when I first wrote it. One is that you don't have to be an angel-human hybrid in order to be called a gibbering, a mighty man. Just as all spiritual beings are Elohim, but not all spiritual beings are like Yahweh. There's only one of those. So in the same way, all Nephilim are mighty men, but not all mighty men are Nephilim. So, Gadala, Nimrod could have just been a great warrior. But he also could have been a Nephilim, So anyway, I write, overall, Michael Jones's interpretation of the Nephilim is implausible. Oh, and also, again, Yahweh is called a Gibborim, and he's not quasi-divine. He's fully divine. He's the original Elohim. So I say, overall, Michael Jones's interpretation of the Nephilim is implausible, and the arguments that he uses to support it in his YouTube video are unpersuasive. It ultimately fails to account for all the evidence. Now, with that said, again, I think that this interpretation is the best rival to the angel hybrid view, and I've got to commend Michael Jones for giving such a strong case for it. I chose to interact specifically with Jones because I thought he gave the best arguments, and I wanted to interact with the best arguments. That's what you do. You want to interact with the best arguments for positions you disagree with. You don't want to interact with the weakest ones. You want to, you want to steel man your opponent. You want to attack their you want their best. But ultimately, I think I think it's the best. To put it this way, I think it's the best of the failures.